let's go. So this morning we're in Acts 16 with verses 16 to 24. Okay, so let me read to us, and then we'll commence from there. So, chapter 16, beginning in verse 16. Now it happened that as we were going to the place of prayer, a servant girl, having a spirit of divination, met us, who was bringing her masters much profit by fortune telling. Following after Paul and us, she kept crying out, saying, "These men are slaves of the Most High God, who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation." And she continued doing this for many days. But being greatly annoyed, Paul turned and said to the spirit, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to leave her." And it left at that very moment. But when her masters saw that their hope of profit had left, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities. And when they had brought them to the chief magistrates, they said, "These men are throwing our city into confusion, being Jews, and are proclaiming customs that are not lawful for us to accept or to observe, being Romans." And the crowd joined together to attack them. And the chief magistrates, tearing their garments off of them, proceeded to order them to be beaten with rods. And when they had inflicted them with many wounds, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to guard them securely, who, having received such a command, threw them into the inner prison and fastened their feet to the stocks. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, this, I will confess, is a very, very, very fascinating passage that I've been looking forward to for a couple of chapters, admittedly, which means I've been looking forward to for a couple of months. There's two broad things that go on in this particular portion that we're going to unpack, and hopefully we can cover it all through today. I suspect we will be able to. That's the plan, at least. And so let's begin in verse 16 and work our way through. It's all interrelated, but there's two broad categories of things that we draw out from this particular text. Okay, so verse 16. Now it happened that as we were going to the place of prayer, this is referencing where they've been in and what we covered last week, okay, to this place of prayer there in Philippi. There's obviously clearly not a synagogue in terms of a dedicated building synagogue, so they're going to the place of prayer. That's what's referenced last week. As they're going there, a servant girl, having the spirit of divination, met us. Now, this is the first point that we jump off at. The way this is described, what does in verse 16, can you read me your version in verse 16?
Now it happened, as we went to prayer, that a certain slave girl, possessed with the spirit of divination.
Okay, so it says the same thing. What's yours?
Mine says, and it happened while we were going into prayer.
Same thing, yeah.
A certain servant girl who had a spirit of divination.
Okay, they're translating it the same, yeah. No, I was just seeing if there was if anyone's translation were using a different word than divination. So this is why the study of the original languages is really not just valuable but important. So she's described as possessing pneumapithon, the spirit of Python. Now you, by your Hellenic ancestry, will know what I'm talking about. I'll bridge the gap for us. So Python was one of the ancient chaos monsters in Greek mythology. Okay, the story goes into a very important part of Greek mythology, ancient Greek mythology. The story goes, based on their view, that this ancient serpent, this dragon, was engaged in great battle with Apollo, one of the most important of the Greek gods. Apollo was a god of many things, but primarily associated with the sun, as opposed to Artemis with the moon. But Apollo associated with things like order and civility and a variety of other things that go along with that. But as opposed to his, I suppose, opposite, that of Dionysius in one sense, which is who was reminiscent or who was representative of drunkenness and ecstasy and et cetera. Apollo slays the dragon Python at a place called Delphi, which is in I suppose you'd say central Greece, out in a place called Mount Parnassos, and then builds over the corpse of Python a temple in his honor, and appoints a high priestess known as the Oracle of Delphi, and she is called the Pythia, right after Python, okay, who was the monster. Now, obviously I'm not stating that really happened. I'm just explaining to you the Greek mythological element because it plays into who this individual is. So the Pythia, who was the high priestess or the Oracle of Delphi, was, without any shadow of a doubt, the most powerful woman in the ancient world. Certainly during the Greek Golden Age of the 5th century, but even down to this day, the Pythia, so in the 1st century AD we are here now, is still, I would argue, the most powerful woman on earth. Closely followed by other oracles or other high priestesses called the Sibyls, and there were 10 in the world by this time, from Rome to Greece to Asia Minor all the way across to Persia. The reason why she was so powerful was because the temple to Apollo at Delphi was basically considered the most sacred place in all of Greece. It was also considered the center of the world in their geographical understanding, and so that kind of fed into the Hellenic understanding of Delphi as a place. It's high upon Mount Parnassos, and so the high places being associated with the gods in all kinds of ancient cultures, including Greece as well, goes there as well. But she was essentially the very mouthpiece of Apollo in the world. And again, it's really due to Apollo's significance more than just hers. It's not something necessarily to do with her. It's by virtue of the fact that she was treated and regarded as the medium or the vessel through which Apollo spoke, basically.
She called the Oracle of Delphi?
Yes. So the title is the Oracle of Delphi, and she's also known as the Pythia, after that connection to the monster Python, who Apollo slays in the story. And so there are a whole bunch of there's a whole temple system there of other priestesses, and this is obviously one of them. But the Pythia was considered so powerful by virtue of how highly revered and regarded the temple of Apollo at Delphi was. So the Pythia, I mean, quite literally, had the power to essentially command nations. Kings would determine whether they went to war or not based on the word of the Pythia. So the mightiest of men in the ancient world, especially in the Greek or the Hellenic world, would operate based on the command of the Pythia. So that kind of power dynamic, you're talking about like the greatest kings in Greece, would be essentially stopped in their tracks if the Pythia said so, right? Very unbelievably powerful. And then subsequently the whole temple system around the Apollonian temple in Delphi kind of flows forward from there. She, being described as having a spirit of divination, literally a spirit of Python, is a very clear indication that she was a priestess of Apollo at Delphi. Not the Pythia, but one of the priestesses underneath the Pythia. Does that make sense? This girl, yep. And so she is clearly connected with that. She's up in Philippi. Whether she's in Philippi permanently or whether she's just in Philippi as it happens at this time, who knows? We're not giving that contextually. But nonetheless, she is a priestess of Apollo. She is obviously connected with the temple of Apollo at Delphi in one form or another. And so this is someone who is part of a very powerful system in the Greco-Roman world, even still by the time we get to the 1st century, which is centuries and centuries after Greece's heyday, so it were. So it's important to bridge that gap of who this woman is contextually, and why on earth she's in this position, right? Because the end of verse 16 says that she was bringing her masters much profit by fortune telling. There's a whole host of reasons why that would be the case, but the most obvious pragmatic reason would be the fact that she would necessarily command, by virtue of her position as a priestess of Apollo in connection with the temple at Delphi, she would command an immediate reverence and respect. When this woman, again, even without being the Pythia herself, being connected as a priestess of Apollo, when she opened her mouth, people listened. and again commanding great power. But here, much like the Pythia, here she's instead that power that she has by virtue of her role or her occupation is being used by wealthy masters in this case, right? To be able to tell fortunes, and that would be. So this is basically an entire, I suppose, like criminal enterprise, I guess. It wouldn't be criminal, but it would be very morally shady. Obviously, you have a group of powerful people who are clearly using a priestess of Apollo in Philippi to tell fortunes in the city. So they're extracting money from average Joe Schmoes who are desperate and who are needing their fortunes and their fate told, their destiny foretold by the priestess of Apollo.
But she's clearly prophesying truths, otherwise they wouldn't return to her.
Correct, and that's what we're going to get onto, especially by the time we get through to verse 18. We'll get there. But even the Pythia herself, the great high priestess, the oracle of Delphi, was also a great power to be wielded by influential vested groups that would seek to try and control her. The way in which she would, and this is helping us understand how powerful this is, right? So I'm trying to give some historical context. One of the fascinating things about Delphi, the old city, there's a city of Delphi there today. It's on the other side of Mount Parnassus, but the ancient city of Delphi, which is all there, it's all in ruins, has chasms underneath the temple, and there are actually, even to this day, trace elements of various different gases like ethylene and potentially also methane that actually run underneath the mountain as just part of the natural kind of gas channels that run underneath the immediate crust of the earth. And so it's pretty reasonably hypothesized that the way in which this was occurring was that gases of various types like ethylene, for example, or methane, would actually come through the chasm underneath the temple, and these are intoxicating. So like ethylene is in like that, the formulaic basis of alcohols, right? And so there's a literal intoxication that she would undergo, and she would go into these, and that lines up with what different ancient Greek historians who were alive at the time say about her. She'd go into these ecstatic trances and would start speaking in all kinds of different languages and blah, 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 blah. So it's not just a purely material thing. It's actually, there is a very serious spiritual element to that too. It's just dark in nature. But it's all tied together. As I'm sure you well know, the word that we translate into English as sorcery is pharmakeia. Pharmakeia is where we get the word pharmacy from. Yeah. So I'm not making any broader implications yet, but
Did you know that?
no. That's just the etymology of the word, yeah.
This is the
Pharmaceutical pharmacy.
sobering nature of Scripture. The word pharmakia in Greek, where we get pharmacy from or pharmaceuticals, doesn't mean potions and infusions and so on. It means witchcraft.
Witchcraft. That's how the ancient Greeks used that word, yeah.
But what the ancients used to do was, in order to convene with the spirits, the dark spirits, they would take potions to open their consciousness.
And it had a very wide planetary kind of meaning. It included everything from just your run-of-the-mill drunkenness in one respect through to using narcotic substances of whatever variety or kind.
Hallucinogens.
Especially hallucinogens, which is the context of the Pythia, right? Hallucinogenic substances, like what would happen if you're inhaling ethylene fumes, that's what's going to happen to you.
You're going to have an altered state of consciousness.
Correct, and that's described, and that's what ends up matching up with the way that like Herodotus and other such ancient historians who were alive at the time write about what would happen to the Pythia. That's why they also had the women who fulfilled that role had a very short lifespan. They would only be Pythia for like a couple of years, and then they'd be found dead because, well, they just OD. Yeah, they'd overdose. They'd be overdosing on ethylene, methane, whatever they happen to be ingesting.
Or other things were going on spiritually for them.
Oh, 100%, yeah, but it was a very short lifespan, very, very short lifespan. So the Pythia as a role would be constantly replaced with a very tightly knit selection process. The woman needed to be a virgin because she was to be the conduit through which Apollo would work, and all this kind of religious stuff that's working through. But the power play and the power manipulation of it, really, like she seriously, like she practically held the hearts of kings in her hand. Although Leonidas I is perhaps the sole exception to that. The famous king of Sparta in the early 5th century, who goes to war against the Persian Empire, who's invading Greece, and his army is actually away at the Olympic Games, which was a festival, religious festival, and according to Spartan law, the Spartan army could not actually go to war when the religious festival was on. Except the problem is that the Persian Empire is invading Greece and he needs to do something. And so he actually heads north first to consult the Pythia.
Is it BC?
Yes, it's BC, sorry, I should say yes, BC. So, around 480 BC, yes. And consults the Pythia, and the Pythia tells him not to go to war against Persia, and he defies the Pythia and takes... That's where the famous story of the 300 Spartans comes from. He takes his personal guard of 300 hoplites, so 300 professional warriors. He can't take his 10,000 man army because they're all at the Olympic Games, and then they fight the Battle of Thermopylae, which was a defeat, obviously, but a famous last stand type of thing. Point I'm drawing is that this woman is very powerful, and she is being used by powerful, interested peoples in Philippi for financial profit. Okay, that becomes important to the broader point that we're going to make by the time we get to the second half. Okay, so keep reading verse 17, and again put a pin in verse 16 because we'll come back to that a number of points. So verse 17, following after Paul and us, she kept crying out, saying, "These men are slaves of the Most High God, who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation." So there is there's a bit of a sinister, this might seem like a novel thing, but she's actually been quite sinister here. She is not saying anything patently untrue. She's simply saying it in a sarcastic way. Yeah. So a couple of points.
Or a mocking.
Yeah, mocking, but the sarcastic mockery saying all tied together.
What does she mean by the Most High God?
Exactly. So let's get onto this. So that's the point number one of the sarcasm is, so when she referred to the Most High God is a very, very common title for God in the Old Testament. So the Most High God, as a reference to Yahweh, to God, is a very familiar statement to Christians and everyone else throughout the scriptures. So at the same time that she's saying these men are slaves or servants of the Most High God, she's not incorrect. The thing is that she knows that when your average Greek in Philippi, who has no knowledge, in any meaningful sense at least, of Yahweh, of God, when they hear Most High God, they're going to think of Zeus. Okay, Zeus was the king of the gods, the king of the Olympian gods. All the different ancient pagan cultures had a lot of commonality. The broadest commonality was that they were all a pantheon, so a grouping of 10, 12, 15 gods, whatever the number happened to be, but usually often 12. And they would be ruled over by a king of the gods, so like a high god. In the case of, in the case of the Greeks, it's Zeus, Jupiter to the Romans, Odin to the Germanics and the Norse, right, the Vikings, etc. later on, etc., etc. And it's a false reflection of the reality, of what is the reality, which is where God, who is the eternal creator, is the Most High God among these other ones referred to as the sons of God, not like Son of God, capital S, like Jesus, but the sons of God, who were appointed to be able to rule over the nations. And that would delve us into a whole different conversation, but at another time. She's saying the Most High God, which is an accurate reflection of what they're doing, except she knows full well that the Greeks to whom they're talking are going to immediately interpret that as Zeus, which is what they're not saying. Do you know what I mean? So she's being sarcastic and mocking and trying to manipulate the audience of people who are listening to Paul and the group, right? And she says, who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation. Now, what's interesting, I'm just going to go back and look because I have a sneaking suspicion here. based on the way I'm reading it in English. Bear with me one moment. 17. Yeah, so so it's interesting. So Chodon soterias, with no definite article.
The road to salvation.
Yeah, but with no definite article could also be understood as a way of salvation. What she's doing here is it's entirely possible that she's actually saying, who are proclaiming to you a way of salvation. I don't think that's necessarily the most immediate or the best translation. So that's why most of your translations should say the, because that tends to be the more direct, natural reading of this passage. Some commentators would argue that she's, by a lack of definite article, she's saying it's a way of salvation, but not the way. It's not the most natural reading of the passage, though. She's using mockery and sarcasm, and that's the way. She, even though she's stating something that, if you just read it in black and white on paper, is functionally true, it's kind of like during the crucifixion of Jesus, people calling him, the Son of God and the King of the Jews, and they're saying it as a mockery. Even though those statements are literally true, with Jesus being the Son of God, King of the Jews, etc., King of Israel, blah, blah, they're saying it as a mockery. They don't believe he is, and so they're mocking him by calling him what people were calling him, right? And she's being manipulative in her use of the word "the Most High God," and I think anyone with a decent enough knowledge of ancient Greek culture would be able to see how she is poisoning the well, so to speak. Poisoning the well is in like manipulating and trying to ruin the message by calling God the Most High God, which is an accurate term, but she's doing it in front of Greeks who are more immediately going to associate that with Zeus. And we've already had an instance back in Derbe, I think it was, or Lystra, 2 chapters ago, where Paul and who else was with him, Barnabas, were being confused for Zeus and Hermes anyway. And so they've encountered this kind of thing, at least broadly speaking, before. She's also following them around, because the Kidron says in verse 17, following after. So she's following around, and Paul and the group, Paul, Silas, etc., Luke, whatever, are talking to groups of people and audiences who are listening to them, and she's just constantly there in the background, just like chiming in, you know what I mean? So it's a concerted effort and an attempt to poison the well, as the saying would go. And in verse 18, she continues,
I was going to say, when I first read this some time ago, years ago, I took it at face value. There is another interpretation of this. I know it goes against the grain, but I liken her to Balaam.
Yes,
and her handlers to Balak. That's in Numbers,
in the Old Testament,
ish, where Balak was a king of Tyre, and he purchased the services of Balaam, the head prophet, to put a curse on Israel. And she is a prophet, let's face it, she is the prophet of Apollo. I took it at face value because there's something about her that I think personally she was seeking truth. She knew she was trapped in this demonic realm, and she was profiting from it, so therefore she stayed, just like Balaam stayed.
Exactly.
Although Balaam's motives would.
But her conscience would have been eating her, no doubt.
Her conscience, because she was following them. Many days, it says here, and she was doing this over many days. So she was either mocking them, or she was genuine. There's no middle ground. I don't think she was half genuine.
No,
that's
mocking. True. Yeah, it's one or the other for sure.
So it's one or the other, and I think that's why Paul was disturbed, because he saw her crying out.
Yeah, it's not completely unreasonable to arrive at that conclusion. It's a generous interpretation, and I wouldn't even go so far as to say that it's like patently wrong, because you can clearly arrive at that conclusion from this passage. Whether that is the overall direction, all it really is, I suppose, it's the same functional conclusion, because the text just says what happens. Like it's a historical. There's nothing like mystical that we're trying to figure out here. there's just historical details like the whole Pythia context and the Delphic context I mentioned earlier. It's the same functional conclusion. I suppose it's just the light in which it's cast. Yeah. Because the broader, what you end up having is, as you just mentioned, you work your way through 18, which we might as well, we'll read it now. But so in verse 18, she continued doing this for many days, right, following around and proclaiming this kind of thing. But being greatly annoyed, Paul turned and said to the Spirit, I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to leave her. And it left her at that very moment, literally that very hour, but it means it left her instantly. Yeah, it depends on how you interpret Paul's reaction, I suppose. In terms of, again, same functional conclusion, just the light in which it's cast.
It's an interesting...
Because his reaction, he's not an idiot. He knows full well. He knows full well who the woman is. He knows full well what her position is.
What the spirit behind her is.
Correct. He knows he is intimately acquainted. Again, Paul is the reason why Paul is, we've explained this obviously plenty of times before, but the reason why Paul was the perfect man to be able to do this in terms of leading the evangelization of the Gentiles is ethnic Jew, cultural Greek, Roman citizen, right? Born and raised in a Greek city, Tarsus, educated as a Greek Roman citizen, and so he knows he is as equally acquainted with Greek culture, Greek religion as he is the Torah. He and so he knows full well exactly who this woman is. He knows all the stories. He's well acquainted with all the religious symbolism, the stories, the whole box and dice, and the story of Apollo, the conquest of Apollo's conquest of Python is a whilst it sometimes gets overshadowed by other more famous, at least today's stories from Greek mythology, in terms of its actual pragmatic ramifications in Greek culture, it's like central, because it's the very thing that sets up the Temple of Apollo at Delphi and the power that institution commanded over not just Greece but the entire Hellenic world was unmatched, right? So it's actually extreme.
Which makes this account even more interesting. If the interpretation I gave a moment ago is correct, my humble view is that having had the Spirit come out of her, she would then have evangelized crowds in the name of Jesus Christ.
You would hope so, yeah. We're not given specifics about what happened to her, so have a look there at what happened. So his address isn't, he doesn't address her. That's what's interesting. He's been putting up with her for days, we're told, and then it eventually reaches a point where he then turns and addresses whatever this power or being was that was influencing her, and says what he says there, and then it departs at that moment. Not because Paul has some incredible power, but rather because of the authority and the power that comes in by virtue of who Christ is. Okay, namely King of Kings, Lord of Lords, God in the flesh, etc. There's another point that's to be brought here, but I'll wait till the end because it kind of just ties into some of the broader take-home points that we get to by the end. The transition then comes in verse 19. Okay, so but when her masters saw that their hope of profit had left, they seized Paul and Silas, right? So at that, basically the last we get mention of her, of the priestess of Apollo, is in verse 18. Okay, so the story kind of immediately we don't get anything about her anymore. The focus transitions, I think wisely. the focus really transitions onto the powerful people, the powerful men who are using a woman of renown, in this case a woman in a powerful position, and wielding her for profit and for financial gain, right? So it's interesting. Paul has dealt with the spiritual power behind the woman, and now he's dealing with the, mortal power behind the woman. So do you understand what I'm getting at, right? Because I'll explain this at the top, but I'll just reiterate that what this group of this proverbial cabal, I suppose, of guys are doing is they are wielding a spiritual / religious power in the form of a priestess of Apollo, someone attached and associated with that institution, and using it for profit and financial gain and power that comes along with that in that city of Philippi. It's criminal syndicate type behavior, right? It's literally just a financial criminal enterprise. It's a profiting and
It's really like a mega health and wealth prosperity gospel church.
in many sense, yeah. And I've made that point before, certainly in sermons, and it would require going into a bunch of text to make it again. But yeah, it's using a religious institution, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, for financial gain, and along with financial gain, power
and
influence.
status.
Yeah, power, influence, status, right? So through money to power, influence, status.
Because they would have had the ears of the governing authorities,
100%.
the governors, the leaders, even the religious leaders would have gone to them for oracular prophecies.
Correct. That's the point. That's what I'm saying to you. Yeah.
So something must have happened to her.
Exactly.
Or
Yeah.
else they just believed that because Paul cast out the demon that
Yeah.
she was ruined.
Well, basically, so yeah, because what happens is, we see that's exactly what verse 19 is saying to us. When her masters saw that their hope of profit have left, what this meant is two things. One, there's a distinctive, noticeable change in the woman that everyone recognizes, both the Christians and the non-Christians. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it also means that when she's telling fortunes, she's not just doing some sleight of hand card tricks. Like, no, she really is actually doing something. Because otherwise you can't make sense of how, and this is not, by the way, this isn't the opinion of Paul, because notice that it's when the masters saw that their hope for profit had left. So she wasn't able to tell fortunes anymore. So that's not like, oh, the Christians are the ones who are saying that she really had the power, but now she doesn't. No, like the Greeks were the ones that were saying, so the non-Christians were the ones that were saying she had this power and now she doesn't. Otherwise, they wouldn't have reacted the way they did. So it's not like the Christians are making this up. It's actually the non-Christians that are making this point. She had a power and now she doesn't, which means inherently, or it means many things, but it means fundamentally that she wasn't just doing some like mentalist mind tricks. Like, there clearly was something beyond just the material. There was a very spiritual reality to what she was doing, and she was actually clearly telling fortunes. Otherwise you can't explain the reaction of the non-Christians in this sense.
It does. The obvious question that it raises for me, and for no doubt the general reader, is how did the handlers know within the space of an hour or less that she had lost the supernatural powers? What was visibly different?
Yeah.
Did she go from looking like a prophetess, someone alluring, to the makeup all gone and a different garment?
Makeup, jewels, the way the hair is styled.
Was she suddenly humble and of humble demeanour? Was
countenance, yeah. I think all the above. I think also then you're tying that in with the fact that this would have been public. So this is the way that this text reads, is that this is not like, Paul was in his hotel room and then, like, it's not some private thing. Like, this is public, right? So Paul's in a crowd, he's in an audience, people are listening to him, and Silas
he exorcises her in front of everyone.
In front of everyone, yeah, exactly. This would have spread like that around Philippi. And it's also assuming, by the way, it's also assuming that the priestess is by herself. There's no reason to think she's by herself at all, actually. Here's what I can absolutely guarantee you: that this priestess, with 100% certainty, knowing ancient Greek culture, I can guarantee you that this woman had armed guards. 100%, no, zero question. This woman absolutely. This is a resource of very powerful people. She 100% had an armed guard, no questions asked. And multiple, like three or four armed guards, no doubt.
People of the crowd would have been jostling to touch her, to get her attention, to ask her advice,
even to touch her garment, the power that they believed that she would have.
Yeah, that's a good point. So her handlers would have said, would have pushed the crowd away.
Correct. It's also absolutely possible that the actual masters are literally there with her.
I think they're with her. That's what the text says.
That's my point, yeah.
I think it adds more and more credence to what I said half an hour ago or whatever. I think one of the main way the crowd and her handlers realised that the spirit, the demonic Python spirit had departed, was that the moment Paul cast the spirit out of her, I think she started to praise the living God of the Bible.
May very well have, yeah. There's nothing that precludes it, certainly.
And which she'd never done before.
Yeah.
And the handlers would have said, huh?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, there would have been a change, yeah. All that's within, obviously again we're not specifically told, but it's nothing there's nothing that precludes that as being a possibility, for sure, 100%, yeah. That's what I'm saying to you, that's what I'm trying to highlight, the public nature of this. This is very public. She 100% has an armed guard. The masters that are being referenced are because when you forget the verse divisions, if you just read verses 18 and 19 without the verse division, you'll see what's being said. So to break it down, you've got, she's following around for many days. Paul becomes annoyed. He turns to the Spirit, verse 18, and says, "Be gone in the name of Jesus." At that very moment, it left her. But then when her masters saw that the hope of profit had left, so they saw it leave. That means they're there.
Yeah,
You see what I'm saying to you? So the way that verse 19 reads, it's coming immediately off the heels of, and it left at that very instance or moment. The way that Greek works, it says literally at that very hour, but that's just a common Greek way of saying at the very moment.
It's very interesting to me that the Holy Spirit has chosen to use words here in 19 to say, and when her owners saw, not that the spirit had departed from her, but that the hope of their profit.
Yeah,
that says it all.
Profit, like money, profit, power.
That says it all.
Their source of wealth and therefore power. And
that's what they were interested in.
Correct. It's money tied at the hip to power in this instance. Yeah. And that's going to establish what the bigger, broader point is.
They knew that there was a spirit there.
100%, yeah.
But they weren't concerned about the ramifications of where the spirit came from.
No, don't care where it comes from. They don't care about the broader context. They don't even care about what a person gets told necessarily. This is a tool being wielded, basically, for financial gain and therefore power, yeah.
And nothing really has changed in our modern age.
Oh, nothing at all. That's the point we're going to get onto. But
there are a lot of practitioners of whatever religion who they don't mind or care particularly where the spirit is coming from, if it's a spirit of darkness,
what their teachings are and how that impacts people's lives. Yeah,
they couldn't care less.
No,
so long as this comes
and power
and this comes, the status.
Yeah, correct, 100%. So, sorry.
Spirits, they are visible.
They can be.
Yeah, can be, but the basic premise is that, as a general principle, no. Because it's a difference between material. So that's why, for example, when you see in the Bible, it read, "No one has seen God," and that's not like because he hasn't interacted with humanity. Of course, we see all throughout the Old Testament, all of his we're going through that right now. How many times God saves Israel and brings them out of this and brings them that way? It's because of the difference between material, which is visible, obviously, and the point that the scriptures make about spiritual things by definition being immaterial, therefore invisible. We, in our modern kind of particularly like secular atheistic understanding of the world at the moment, tend to think that if something is invisible, it is therefore not real, or it's somehow not a real
fantasy, or
exactly. It just, but it doesn't. But again, I've explained that before. I don't know whether it was last week or the week before. I was explaining. I think it was 2 weeks ago when it was you and Jen. I was explaining the whole thing about the mind and the fact that we don't see the mind. We see the brain as the organ, but no one sees the mind that is communicating right now and is doing all these things. You don't see that. It's not going to come up on an MRI or such things. You'll see the physical organ, but you don't see the mind that we have. No one sees the wind. You see all the byproducts and the consequences of wind. You see the leaves fluttering past. You can feel the wind, but you're not seeing anything come out unless you put another substance in it, like you put a powder. Then you're going to see that, but that's no different than putting leaves there. You're not actually seeing the wind, as it were. You're seeing the consequences of the wind. And Jesus actually uses that analogy. In the Gospels, he actually uses that analogy of not being able to see. The little one I'm saying, of you don't see the wind. You see the consequences of things moved by the wind. You feel the wind, but you can't visually see it.
And it's very important, the question, because
exactly.
The word wind in both Hebrew and Greek is also the very same word for spirit.
Yeah. Ruach in Hebrew, pneuma in Greek. It's the wind and spirit. It's the exact same. So the way that ancient people used those terms were actually synonymous. So like we have the word wind and spirit as
and we've lost that.
Yeah, we have them as two different English words. But ancient and that's not just Hebrew and Greek, by the way, but other languages as well. But obviously in the case of the Bible, Old Testament written in Hebrew for the most part, a little bit of Aramaic sprinkled here and there, but New Testament Greek. Those are not the Greek language. That does, again, keep in mind that comes from the pagan Greeks. So it's not like they were thinking in a Christian context at all.
Actually,
right?
It comes from Hebrew, but we won't go there.
No, I know that, but I'm talking about the later connection on through the text.
You'll not get a secular linguist, paleontologist, or whatever their title is.
Paleolinguist.
You will not get a secular paleolinguist admitting what I just said.
Yeah, even though it's very, yeah, exactly. Well, you will get some when it's pressed on, but it's obvious, and it's not, and it's not like some weird, like all you're doing is just tracing etymological roots of word. It's
pretty obvious to any reader.
Yeah, it's very, very obvious, and we know that they used it that way. That's the thing. Yeah, so wind and spirit were used like with ruach in the same sense. So because that's the analogy. You don't see the wind, but it's obviously real. Again, what does gravity look like? Well, it doesn't look like anything. It doesn't look like anything. It's a force. Yeah, exactly. You don't see it. So the notion that only that but that goes back to this whole the problem with the fundamental philosophies of the Enlightenment, that only that which I can sense or experience, measure with my senses, through seeing or blah blah. Only that is real. But again, I've just pointed you to wind and gravity and things which you cannot see, even things which we can see with certain instruments, but we naturally can't see certain ends of the electromagnetic spectrum, right? We can't see infrared, for example, right? So if you're talking, IR lasers, which you can see when we put on night vision goggles, for example, we can't see that with the naked eye. Now we can see it when we use technology, but right up until the moment of that invention, you wouldn't have a clue that the infrared end of the spectrum exists because you can't see it. But of course we know it exists, and now we can see it with the aid of technology. Do you know what I mean? So there's all kinds of things we don't see. The idea that, unless I can see it, it mustn't be real. Like it just doesn't make, it's disprovable by those kinds of things alone.
It's a shame, isn't it, that philosophy doesn't do us any favours.
Oh, no, exactly. Yeah, this doesn't help us. Yeah. People knew this up until Enlightenment philosophy became the predominant ideology in the West over the last 200 years. And then but this hasn't helped us. Like it's only...
It's a shame. It's hindered us.
Yeah, exactly. It's hindered us in terms of our understanding of ourselves, of the world in which we live, and all these kinds of things. It hasn't helped us in any respect. That's why, most people think I have some axe to grind against the Enlightenment. It's not some specific axe to grind per se. It's just the fact that I recognise how much our modern cultural understanding in the West has been influenced by the quote-unquote Enlightenment, and the fact that it has things which can be demonstrated to be erroneous. That's all.
It has hindered us in our perception of the Most High God.
Yeah, hence my term earlier about perception
and here's
of reality.
the irony, we've got a servant girl, I don't know, was she 16, was she 26?
She young.
Knew who the Most High God was.
Yeah, correct, and she was a powerful pagan prophetess, yeah, pretty says, yeah.
No, a whole lot of different philosophers stating this idea.
Yeah, I mean the about what I was saying earlier regarding the Enlightenment. Yeah, yeah, exactly. That was and the way that was conceptualized was different depending on. There were two broad streams, two different kind of groups or traditions in the Enlightenment. You had the rationalists and the empiricists. The rationalists, this is again massive oversimplification just for the sake of time, but the rationalist perspective was basically that only that that we can learn and understand the world through purely rational lens, and we should only try to seek to understand things through a rational lens. The thing is, though, is that whilst so rationality and logic are good, and you hear me talk about that all the time, because we have as people, we have been given a logical and a rational capacity, right? We can think through things in a way that makes sense. But the rationalists of the Enlightenment era, their understanding was that, for starters, human beings can come to a rational understanding of all these things apart from or separate from God, even though God is the source of life and the very source of logic and reason. But also, more importantly, only that which we can actually perceive of rationally is real. Now, the big problem you run into is, what if you run into something that you can't rationally figure out because you are yourself a mortal, finite person, you're limited in knowledge, and there's something that is beyond your personal understanding at that time. That's where you run into a brick wall. And the problems with the rational side are much more deeper than that, but that's the basic sense. The other side, the empiricist side, which is really where the problems are even heavier, is that only that which can be empirically measured through particularly the senses, your sight, smell, touch, taste, feel, and hearing, only that which can be empirically received and understood through the five senses, that's all that's real. Right? So that's the philosophical basis of atheism, for example. Prove to me scientifically through material means that God exists. Now, apart from the fact that I would argue you actually can do that, that part aside, it's demanding an answer from the wrong measure, right? So it's demanding that you give me answers to spiritual nature or spiritual reality through a purely physical means, even though the entire point is that the spiritual reality of the world is by definition not material. It's not physical, right? You can't just see it, just like we also can't see the wind or can't see gravity. Now, those are obviously physical things to a degree, although gravity's complex. But nonetheless, point being that there are multitudes of things which destroy the idea that only that which we can perceive through the senses. So things like beauty, right? There are clearly things in the world that are beautiful. How on earth do you use the scientific method to determine whether something's beautiful? You can't. Right? Mathematical proofs. So mathematics itself, even the basic idea that 2 + 2 = 4, can't be demonstrated through the scientific method, because in order to do science, you have to presume that maths is real and that it's logical. And so you can't prove mathematics using science, because to do that, you have to actually presume math to do the science. You see what I mean? So maths is not empirically verifiable. There's all manner of other things that go along those kinds of ideas. So the notion that was raised in empiricism as an Enlightenment era philosophy can be demonstrated to have been wrong. But the problem is it became very, very popular. And we're currently living through the consequences of like 200 to 300 years of that prevailing philosophy. So it became very popular among European scholars and academics, particularly French and German, but then also English as well later on. And then that kind of filtered down from academia into the rest of society.
Including in warfare, where we've had hundreds of millions of deaths as a
Correct.
result of...
Oh, exactly, yeah. So the First and Second
God.
The First and Second World Wars are direct results of the Enlightenment. So the kind of carnage that you see in the First World War, with just the wanton, flippant expenditure of human life, comes down to the prevailing notion by the time you get into the early 1900s that we are all just merely, for starters, we're all just slightly more evolved apes. We're just simply a primate species, and we're just simply cogs in a proverbial machine that is the nation state. And so that's why you can get things like you go to the Battle of the Somme and you have 14,000 troops die on day one, right? In one day, and then how many troops die the next day? Well, 14,000, because all the prevailing idea militarily is we're just going to throw bodies at the problem. And they're expendable because who cares? And they just are just one little cog in the atom, or an atom that serves in the greater part of the whole. And the expenditure of life, no care in any meaningful sense for the value of an individual life, which comes not just from an Enlightenment thing, it actually comes from, again, a Christian understanding of the world, the fact that all human beings, even at the individual level, are created in the image of God and are therefore have an inherent worth and dignity to life, that life shouldn't just be thrown away so easily, even in war. But that's why you get the First World War. It's highly mechanized, it's machine-based. You have the arrival of chemical warfare, at least on a mass level in World War One. And then by the time you roll around to World War II, that's where the Enlightenment really rears its head, because the Eastern Front, classic example, Nazi Germany versus Soviet Union, both those ideologies, communism and fascism, trace their roots back to the Enlightenment. You going to say something?
Yeah, ironically, you said earlier about the cog and the greater machine. There's a horrible irony there, because the Enlightenment led to atomization, individualization.
Yeah, good point. Because but that's the problem though. So for example, exactly. So it's in the Enlightenment that you get the birth of liberalism as a philosophy, which is what underpins things like liberal democracy, for example, which is what the West prevailingly is now. And obviously, I have.
What does that actually mean?
Yes, that's fine. Yeah. So liberalism. So liberalism, or the word liberal, coming from the Latin word libertas, which is where we get the word liberty from. And whilst liberty can and is a good thing in one sense, liberty can also, like many other things in life, be greatly abused. And really, what the movement of liberalism was, and plenty of people would disagree with me on this, and that's fine. But liberalism as a philosophy that arises in like the late 1600s, moving through the 1700s and the 1800s, was far more often used in the sense of, again, that kind of Enlightenment era idea of human beings trying to figure it out and reconstruct society apart from God. Right? So you saw this growing and increasing movement away from Christianity in the 1700s and 1800s in favour of liberalism. And liberty in this context really means, well, it means many things, but foundationally it means liberty from this. Liberty, that's why I laugh.
Perceived liberty.
Perceived liberty, yeah. Liberty from moral constraints determined by God. Not an abandonment of moral constraints, but rather morality coming from man first, not as opposed to God. So obviously Christians have always believed that morality is not determined by us, it's determined by the character of God, right? Murder is wrong because God is the giver of the author of life. He gives life, takes life. Theft is wrong because God is the one who distributes things to people, right? All these kind of things. That idea starts to be moved away from in the movement of liberalism and liberal democracy in favour of the individual and individual religion, individual rights, individual this. And again, see, some of these things are worthwhile, right? Everything I've been saying about COVID and stuff, I clearly believe that people have rights. Like, that can't be, no one can say that I can't. I don't believe that. I clearly do. But it's about the context in which that occurs, because the prevailing philosophy and idea throughout Europe, in this case, all the way up until the Enlightenment, as a Christian idea, was that the individual is not actually the basis of society, the family is, right? So communism goes the other direction. Communism basically goes, we have to destroy the family and reduce everyone down to an individual, but an individual who's just part of the greater whole, right? So it's kind of like the analogy I give. It's like little beans in a bean bag. You know what I mean? There's no rigidity. It's all just everyone's. He used the term atomized. To atomize is in like brought down to a single common denominator. When everyone's just an individual, you can manipulate them as part of the greater whole. And what ends up happening when you reduce significance, or the kind of foundational unit, down not from the family but to the individual, is now that individual just blends in with every other individual. Whereas a family is a distinct unit. Do you know what I mean? This family, and then there's this family and this family, and they're all part of a context, right? Their family, their clan, their community.
It's about headship, though.
Exactly, it's about headship. It's about authority.
Because the headship of the family is the father.
Yep.
When there's a father.
Yep, correct.
Whereas headship with an individual, the state is the head.
Correct, and that's how that's played out. That's how fascism works. That's how communism works. Yeah.
That is something that has been schemed at.
Yes, definitely.
I believe.
Yeah, correct.
Lots of people believe that this is not an accident, what we see in the last 50, 60, 70 years.
100%. That's my point.
Post-World War II.
Yep.
World War I and World War II did massive damage to individual...
Correct.
What's the noun? Spiritualism? Spirituality?
Spirituality, sure.
Because a lot of people in World War I and World War II hated God. Because the world was burning, the world was being blown up, their roofs were missing. They blamed God.
And that's the point. Is it's like and the reason for that exactly, yeah. So Christianity starts declining after World War I, and then really after World War II. The problem is that, and that's in the West, not in the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, Christianity is increasing, but in the West, it's declining. The thing, though, is that was a failure to actually see the reasons as to why this was going on. It basically treated World War I and World War II as if this was something that happened to us, as opposed to we, on all sides, Entente, Axis, it didn't matter, whatever side, that we had actually created the very context, the little petri dish that actually allowed this to happen, right? I'm not going to get into a history of how World War I happened, because you have to go all the way back to the Napoleonic War to do that. But it comes down to cultural movements that had been developing in Europe, even by the time you get to World War I, had been developing for nearly 200 years by that point, through the 1700s, 1800s. Hence my point earlier about the way in which the human being was viewed. The reason why fascism and communism became so powerful was for a variety of reasons, but the fundamental philosophical reason was that it broke down and destroyed the family as a basic unit, right? The individual was the thing that mattered, right? But when you do that, you end up making the individual just blend in with the group of every other individual, because there's nothing that distinguishes it anymore. Family can be distinguished from a different family. One individual can't be distinguished from any other individual, because they're just one person. You just blend in with the crowd. That's why you end up with scenarios like in Nazi Germany, where you have children reporting their parents to the SS, or in the Soviet Union, you have a husband or a brother or a sister or a relative dobbing each other into the Stasi and to the KGB, because family didn't even matter anymore. The individual loyalty to the state is what mattered, right? And so that's then coupled with, you remove God like Nazi Germany did, you remove God like the Soviet Union did, etc., etc. And who fills the place? The state. Because now the state's the highest authority. There's no authority, and that happens two ways. You remove kings and then you remove God. By removing the king, like you did in France, America, etc., Germany, blah, blah, Russia as well, there's no longer any authority above the aristocracy, right, the politicians. So now the politicians run the show, and also corporate interest in and around them. That's what happened in Germany, for example. And then on the religious, that's the political side. On the religious side, remove God, and so now who's the highest authority? Well, whoever makes the laws. Again, the politicians.
Whoever has the greatest power.
Whoever has the greatest power. Yeah, whoever has the most power. And that always ends up being the state. So with no higher political authority than the politicians, a king, with no higher religious authority than the politicians, God, you've dispensed any level of accountability above themselves, and so then the political class or the state, however it happens to be configured, is the most powerful entity in the land. And that's exactly what we went through with COVID. And
well, actually, we've gone beyond that, arguably.
Oh, sure, but at a basic level, that's the same principle, where there's no...
They can just be manipulated.
Yeah.
Like other people within the enormous power.
Correct, exactly, yes.
Wealthy.
Exactly,
Yeah.
which is what you're seeing kind of in this story. Yeah.
The corporate oligarchs.
Corporate oligarchy, yeah. Exactly, 100%, yeah. Because all you end up having is, all it then takes is remove... Well, they can't really do it, but in their mind, that's what they're doing in terms of how they perceive it. They remove God from their consideration, So they no longer feel morally accountable to anyone above them. And so now they can just simply manipulate and coerce, like you just said. So that's what leads you to, basically buying and owning a politician through what today we call campaign donations, what used to just be called any other time in history bribery.
Graft and corruption.
Yeah, we love euphemisms in the West now. So we call bribery campaign donations, all these kinds of things that we do where we just use euphemism. When intelligence agencies torture people, we call it enhanced interrogation techniques. When we have an entire industry dedicated to killing babies in the womb, we call it termination of pregnancy, not murder. 1,000 other things. We actually more than that. We don't just call it termination. We call it healthcare. We call it healthcare and reproductive rights. Reproductive rights for everyone other than the child that gets killed in the process. And so euphemism is how we operate, because it's allowing us to detach from the moral accountability that we actually do have, and it soothes our conscience into thinking that we're not actually doing anything all that wrong. But the point you raised, yes, about wealthy, powerful interests, that's all that's left. That's the highest authority, with no king on the political side, no king above the politicians. On the religious side, no God above the politicians. It's the perfect storm to then allow not just politicians, but those whom they work with and who they are literally bolstered by and upheld by powerful corporate financial interests to then run the show. And so what you're seeing is just this, right? So as we read through, keep in mind everything we just said there. And so let's turn back to this and you'll see exactly how this plays out, okay? So I'll go from 19 just to read through. So, but when her masters saw that their hope for profit, profit, financial gain, had left, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities, okay? Wealthy business interests, who do they go to first? The governmental authorities, which is just what we just literally spent time talking about. And when they had brought them to the chief magistrates, right, so governmental officials, they said, "These men are throwing our city into confusion, being Jews, and are proclaiming customs that are not lawful for us to accept or observe, being Romans." I explained this, I think, a fortnight ago in one of our church history lessons, the ways in which the different laws that Christians were arrested and charged under in the Roman Empire, and one of those was the practice of religio illicita, so a legal religion. Christianity was illegal, because it hadn't actually it was comparatively new in the eyes of the Romans, so it hadn't gotten any approval. But more importantly, it clearly from the get-go violated other such precepts of Roman state religion, namely that the emperor is not a god, that the Roman gods are nothing but lesser powers, and there is in fact only one creator god, etc., etc., etc. But the particular thing that's coming from this preaching would have been all of the above. They say that these men are throwing our city into confusion, being Jews. They hadn't, again, at this time, the Roman Empire on an authoritative level, on a governmental level, hasn't really made much of a distinction yet between Jews and Christians, because one is kind of born out of the other, obviously, but that part is just a contextual detail. But their reasoning in verse 21 is that they're proclaiming customs that are not lawful for us to accept or to observe, being Romans. No doubt Paul would have been saying that the emperor is not a god, the emperor is but a man, and he has a higher authority and power above him, who is God. That the emperor is not the son of God, but rather Jesus is. That the emperor is not the King of Kings, but rather Jesus is. All these kinds of various things. As we've explained in church history lessons before, for example, as well as here, the Roman propagandistic understanding of the state was that the emperor was Divi Filius, the son of God, stretching all the way back to the fact that Julius Caesar, whilst not literally the first emperor, he was in the popular sense the first emperor, the first dictator or imperator of Rome, and he was deified upon his death, and so then all the emperors after him, especially in this Julio-Claudian dynasty, were sons of God. And so they were proclaiming a level of divine status and authority that came with it. And no doubt Paul and co were preaching against that, that no. And especially when we get into the next chapter and Paul gives a famous, very, very, very famous speech in Athens itself. We look forward to that one where he goes into those specific details and we get a whole transcript of what he says. And so they again complain that Paul and Silas are breaking Roman law. Now they were breaking Roman law, so that's one thing to point out. They were decisive. They were categorically breaking Roman law if they were preaching that the emperor is not a god, that the state was not owed your ultimate allegiance, but rather God who's above the state, etc., 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 etc. That there is only one true God, not the whole Roman pantheon. All these kind of things. But this is a fascinating point that, again, now in the West we have a very good context for hopefully actually getting a better understanding of, at least pragmatically for your average punter, which is that something being illegal is ultimately irrelevant in the light of the question of whether something is immoral. So illegality does not equal immorality and vice versa. So something may be deemed legal that is in fact immoral. On the contrary, flip side of that, something may be deemed illegal that is in fact moral, right? Morally good. So legality is not the metric for morality. Legality is not the metric for ethics. There has to be something above and beyond, logically speaking, and that's exactly what the Christian position has been literally forever, since day one. That there is a higher authority and power above the state and therefore the law of the state, right? And that is God, and that is God's law, and that the state's law, the law of the state, is only as valid and right as it is in conformity to the law of God. The state could go ahead and decriminalise murder, which it already has because we have abortion, but I'm talking even in a more plenary sense. It could go ahead and decriminalise in some radical move murder of any kind, homicide of any kind. That wouldn't now magically make homicide morally acceptable, right? And so the average person understands that, right? That's like I can say that to just about anyone and they would understand what that means, right? Except we violate that principle all the time. So you point to something like abortion, or you point to something like various other things that are perfectly legal in modern Australian society that shouldn't be. Things regarding, drugs and various other things regarding
prostitution,
prostitution,
euthanasia, reduced responsibility in murder cases.
Yep, well, reduced responsibility, especially for goodness sake. Yeah, that's been exploited to no tomorrow. Pornography, all these other various things which are so blatantly not just immoral, but actually destructive to human flourishing, which are not good for people. But yet nonetheless the state aids and abets by making them legal. Simply the state, that's the whole point of what we went through with COVID. It's exactly what I said to the churches before you came along. But what I said to them here is that what is clearly proclaimed is that the state is a minister of God. It's appointed by God. It gets difficult to uphold that idea when you have purely directly elected democracies, but that part aside. The point being, though, that the state is ultimately accountable not unto itself, but unto rather God. The state does not have the right to determine what is right and wrong. A higher authority does that, which is why in the West we've spent so much time now over the course of centuries trying to get rid of that higher authority, so that then the only thing that's left at the top is the wealthy / political class.
For corrupt politicians.
Corrupt politicians, yep, that then now run the show. That's the whole premise. That's the whole idea.
Look at the European Union. It's a classic example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The European Union has the European Union Parliament in Brussels, which is not a parliament.
No, it's not even. No, exactly. It's a
they
joke.
do not make legislation.
No.
They rubber stamp legislation which has been authored
from the European Council.
By the European Council, who are unelected.
Yeah. So the European Parliament, it has this air of democracy, so-called, and this air of representation. So people elect the European Parliament, and that then is given this visage of, we're voting on it and we're representing the various peoples of Europe. Except the law doesn't originate from them, it originates from the council, which is unelected. So it's actually an unelected oligarchy that's really producing it. Now, if that unelected, I'm not necessarily having an issue with the unelected side per se. I am in this context, but because it ends up just becoming one giant circular machine of, in this case, people with no authority above them. There's no king of the European Parliament. There's no, and they have nothing. They have no concern for God's law, and so there's no political or religious power above these people, and that's where you end up with the problems.
The way they've orchestrated it is very clever, because if you go to any EU member state, such as Portugal or Greece or whatever, you look around and you think, wow, like beautifully architecturally laid out pavements and new high-rise buildings, and people have everything they want, except something's missing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, correct.
And we're getting like that too. We have all our consumer good needs attended to, but there's something missing.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, exactly. We've built for ourselves just about every creaturely comfort that we can think of, every luxury and convenience that we could possibly hope for, but at what cost? Right. The thoughtful Christian perspective on this is that we have gained all manner of material wealth and luxury and comfort and convenience, and we've poisoned our souls in the process. We are slipping further and further away from what is right and what is good. So not just in the moral sense of right and good, so right as in ethical, good as in moral, but also good in the sense of what is actually good as in conducive to human benefit and flourishing. The morality and the law of God is not meant to be some shackle. In fact, it's actually described as the opposite. It's liberty, because it's the proverbial realm in which we can actually live free and safe from things that are harm. I don't mean safe according to like the government's definition of safe. I mean genuine safety from things that are harmful to us, right? These various things that we do in our society now that are perfectly legal are not beneficial for us. They are in fact harmful, right? Illicit narcotics that are consistently being more and more legalized as a broad thing, at least in the West. Various other things we rattled off earlier, prostitution, pornography, this and that, da-da-da. Dietary guidelines, yeah, correct, yeah, the old food pyramid back in the day, yeah. All these thousands of things, the various different substances that we ingest into our body, knowingly or unknowingly, through food, through water, through 1,000 other mediums, that are perfectly legal but also not good and conducive for human flourishing. That's why European civilization through the Middle Ages blossomed and flourished in a way that had never been seen in the world, because they were Christians, because they built their society on the Bible. They built their society on Christian understanding of how the world is, of how the world operates. They had all these things. They had hierarchy. They had, therefore, order. They had civility. They had laws, right? And these were not shackles, but these are actually, in fact, the very thing that brought freedom. I think I've used this analogy before in a sermon at some point, but we think of moral constraints or law as being like something that hinders us. It doesn't. The analogy I often give is, and every farmer could tell you this, by the way, Christian, non-Christian, doesn't matter, is that you need to have a fence line on the perimeter of your property, right? Otherwise, what happens? Well, all manners of enemies get in, wolves, dingoes, da-da-da-da-da, right? Coyotes, depending on what part of the world you're in, right? All manner of predators get into your property.
Hostile neighbours tilling your land.
That's what I was about to say next, yeah. If you can't determine where your property ends and your neighbour begins, then guess what you now have? You have turf wars. We're fighting over which part of the land belongs to you and belongs to them, and having their cattle come onto your land and graze your fields and destroy your crops, and da-da-da. That's what happens, right? That's what happens when you don't have boundaries. And every farmer can tell you this, right? The boundaries and the fence, right? The boundaries is actually what provides freedom and peace. The predators don't get in, peace. You don't have wars with your neighbours over territory, right? Territorial disputes, turf wars, peace. It's almost perhaps like God knows what he's talking about. Like it's not, but that's how, and so all these kinds of things, the fence line, the boundary line, isn't there to hurt you, it's to help you. Every single cliff and lookout that we have up here, that millions of people visit every single year, the fence line isn't to stop you from getting a good view or from enjoying the scenery of nature. It's to make sure you don't fall off the cliff. That's the exact same principle of laws, right? Biblical laws. And when you abandon that, chaos is what follows, because the opposite of order is chaos. You'll have order, you'll have Christ and his order, or you'll have chaos. And so what happens here is that the law that they're trying under, what they're doing is illegal as far as Rome's concerned. So it's not like Rome's making this up. They are doing something that is illegal. The problem is the law is immoral. And so they have no obligation, biblically, to obey this. Earlier on in the book of Acts, going all the way back to chapter 5, at that point it was Peter and John who are arrested by the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem under the same principles, proclaiming that Jesus is the Messiah, that he's the King of Kings, all these kind of things, same things. And they arrest them. And Paul, in that case, Peter, says straight up to the Jewish authorities, we must obey God over men. Right? When tyrants come up with laws that are contrary to the law of God, our obligation is not just universal submission to the state, rather, we obey God over tyrants. Ta-da.
There's been a lot of that said in the last few years.
Yeah, correct, 100%, 100%. And my position on that was the exact same I'm not saying this to boast, I'm just saying this to give my bona fides, especially on camera. My position on this was the exact same since day one. From day one of COVID, my position never changed. No churches should not lock down, no masks should not be mandated. Well, masks weren't mandated at that point, but I was saying back in like March and April of 2020, give it a couple of months and they'll bring in mask mandates. And then lo and behold, we get to October and Berejiklian brings in mask mandates. I said this like 6 months in advance. Not because of some act of clairvoyance, just because of logic. You could see what they were going to do. But my position on this was the exact same from day one. I didn't change my opinion on COVID. My opinion on COVID and lockdowns and all the governmental action was exactly the same from day one. It remained the exact same every single day and has since. That's called consistency, and that's, by the grace of God, right? I'm not trying to say that to boast. I'm just trying to say that the difference is I had thought through these issues before we arrived at COVID. That's the problem. A lot of people were blindsided, and that's the problem. Sadly and unfortunately. And so they've gone to the magistrates here, and then in verse 22, the crowd joined together to attack them, the mob, good old democracy in action, and the chief magistrates, tearing their garments off them, proceeded to order them to be beaten with rods. Now this is an extremely important point, because again, context. So they're attacking Paul and Silas. Other parts of the group, like Luke and Timothy, are not attacked because they're Greeks. Okay, so Luke is Greek. And they're there. Yeah. And so it's a group. It's more than just Paul and Silas. It's a whole group of Christians. Yeah, a group of those Christian men. Paul is leading them, but there's Paul, there's Silas, there's Luke, there's Timothy, and there would also be others as well. And so you have this scenario. I think, is Barnabas with them at this point? No. Can't remember whether Barnabas was with them at this point.
I don't think so.
No, Barnabas went off the other direction. That was right. Yep, that was the whole dispute. So anyway, but long story short, he has at least the core group of guys is Paul, Silas, Luke, and Timothy. Luke, who they picked up in Troas. Hence why it's now all this,
we
met us and we and stuff. Yeah, that's what we pointed out in weeks prior. But Luke is Greek. Timothy is half Greek. So one side Jewish, one side Greek. So there's still that Hellenic element. But Paul and Silas are both Jews, just thoroughly Jewish. Even though Paul is, again, born in a Greek city and educated as a Greek, and is also a Roman citizen, that doesn't necessarily matter to them because they're just seeing him as a Jew. But the point I want to bring up here, which is really, really important, is that we know for a fact that Paul and Silas, especially Paul as the kind of leader, they're both Roman citizens. Okay, that's important to point out because beating up a Roman citizen is categorically and just 100% illegal by Roman law, right? Beating up a Roman citizen, especially like governmental authorities beating up a Roman citizen, is completely illegal by Roman law, right? So what this is saying, as well as even certain execution methods. So, for example, the ways in which some Christians in the early empire were executed was illegal. So crucifying a Roman citizen was completely illegal. Meanwhile, Rome did that to a number of Christians who were also Roman citizens. So
look at the arch hypocrisy here.
That's what I'm getting onto. Yeah.
The first thing they do is they appeal to the law of the land.
That's what I'm getting on. Yeah.
The enemies of Paul and Silas.
The magistrates and the powerful.
On the one hand, they appeal to the magistrates, the law of the land, but on the other hand, they're breaking their very law of the land.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't be...
Exactly.
And look at the hypocrisy that happened to our society over the last 3 years.
Exactly. That's my point. And so this is one of the big meta-narrative points. So they're beating the piss out of Paul and Silas here. Completely and utterly illegal to beat a Roman citizen. That's not my opinion. We know for a fact that Roman law, this was completely illegal. This didn't go for other people, by the way. So if you were not a Roman citizen, this would have been legal. So it was completely legal to beat up a Roman citizen like this. If you were not a Roman citizen, it was fair game, right? So that in itself is injustice, right? It's unequal weights and balances of the law, which God hates, and He says that literally. He hates unequal balances, which is exactly what we did, because we,
one law for one.
One law for one. Yeah, laws for thee and not for me. You got politicians going around and putting in mask mandates and constricting social gatherings and 6 foot part, 6 foot distances or whatever the heck it was, 1.5 meters, and then meanwhile you all catch them at a party at some house in Vaucluse,
and Polly's resigned over that in Europe, in Australia, or in America.
In America, yeah, exactly, yeah. The governor of California, some of the strictest laws in the world, apart from places like Melbourne and Australia, and then gets caught at a dinner party in LA. Didn't
Boris resign? Didn't Bojo resign over such a scandal?
Boris Johnson got caught at a party.
Yeah.
No mask, just people packed into some townhouse in London. Yeah, it's ridiculous. And so that's the behavioural side, but then also the actual bigger, the kind of broader societal side of we're going to shut down churches, which are, whether people like it or not, we're going to shut down churches which are still massively influential in the lives of everyday Australian citizens. Meanwhile, we're going to move heaven and earth to make sure that bottle shops and brothels are kept open. And why? No, because we said so. Ta-da, right? It's not so. Yeah, the point, and that's the point that was then getting moved on to, is the absolute blinding hypocrisy of these people is just disgusting, right?
Arguably, we are back in the times that Act 16 is talking about.
In our respect, yeah, sure.
Arguably,
yeah,
because we didn't see this in the 1950s. Across the Western world, we didn't see this sort of arch hypocrisy played out.
Certainly not in such an obvious sense. In such an obvious sense, sure. Sure.
And therefore, it just raises an alarm bell for me whether other spiritual matters spoken about in Act 16 are also now arguably applicable in our day and age. And therefore, should the Christian who's cognizant of these things be on the lookout?
Certainly on the political side, 100%. So I take your meaning as broader than the political. I get what you're saying. But at least even on the most obvious level for people to be able to kind of comprehend and see in front of them, is that this is the consequences. Because again, keep in mind that Rome at this point in its history is functionally, on a political sense, exactly like we are now. Almost exactly. Because even though the imperator, the emperor, was honoured and worshipped as a son of God, at the end of the day, all that is the divinization of the Roman state, okay? So the deification of the Roman state. And there still, though, there is a higher authority than the Roman state, in the sense that there is the Roman gods, okay? But in terms of the practical way that this actually plays out in early Rome, during what we call the Principate, of Rome, which is this kind of first half of the Roman Empire before it moves into what's called the Dominate. The emperor is still, at least on a visible level, clearly the most powerful influence in Rome, right? He really functionally is treated as just one of the other gods, right? So the Roman state, on a functional level, really is, at least at a minimum, co-equal with the Roman gods. Does that make sense? So whilst the Roman pantheon still exists, it's not necessarily on a functional level. On paper, you could argue it would be, but functionally speaking, you can very clearly see from history that the Roman pantheon, the Roman gods, were not like above the Roman state. Functionally speaking, I think it's rather clear from history that the Roman state was treated on the same level as the Roman gods. Does that make sense? So then functionally, there was no higher authority than the Roman state. There were co-equal authority, right, the Roman gods and all the various cults that came with it. But functionally speaking, the Roman state was the highest. Well, we're just back there now, where the state is functionally treated as the highest authority. And that's where the problems lie. You've got I mentioned that dualistic sense. Politically, with no king, now I know obviously we have a king of Australia, but functionally speaking, it's rendered utterly useless and meaningless in any political sense. Legally, you would know full well that...
Legally, look, even...
full well that that's the case.
In a day-to-day sense, who these days speaks about appealing to the king?
Yeah, no, exactly. That's my point, yeah, and you know that full well from a legislative background or jurisprudential background. Is that, yes, of course, we obviously have a vice-regent instead, namely the Governor-General of Australia, but functionally he quite literally is ceremonial and rubber stamps any bill successfully put through the Federal Commonwealth Parliament. So functionally speaking, we do not have a king. Functionally, we are what you may even term a crowned republic, as many different political commentators have called it. So we are functionally speaking a republic, at least in terms of the pragmatic senses. Not literally, but pragmatically, how it ends up happening is we are. So the problem Australia has is that we have no higher authority than the state. Now, in reality, there is. God hasn't gone anywhere. But in terms of how the state operates and how people think about things and how they then function, there's no higher authority in the land than the government. Hence why we had to have daily, press conferences at 11 a.m. from Dear Leader, telling us how we're meant to think and telling us what our opinions should be and telling us literally what the truth is. If I'm to steal...
Including things like, do not talk to your neighbour.
Yeah, do not talk to your neighbour. Don't interact with them. Do not talk. Yeah, you literally had like Brad Hazard at one point say, do not talk to your neighbour.
Actually, it was the chief medical officer who, between herself and the one in Queensland and the one in Melbourne, never treated one single patient in their whole lives, in their whole career.
Oh yeah, exactly. It's a purely it's a purely bureaucratical position that arose out of nowhere. By the way, exactly. Like it's not. That's why I've. And it's not meant to be an insult to medical practitioners everywhere. It's only to this. That's why I've commonly referred to as the white-robed oligarchy. Like this magic. These figures of unprecedented authority in terms of chief medical officer of a given state that just arose into the public consciousness practically like as an apparition out of thin air. That then now wielded literally the most power of anyone in the state. So without being smart, you want to know what the power of the Pythia was in the ancient world? Have a look at the chief medical officer. So the Pythia was not a political position, right? It wasn't like she wasn't a queen. Okay, she was a distinctly religious authority. But the power that was then influenced over politics by the Pythia, if you want just a taste of what that was kind of like, not literally the same, but kind of like, look at the chief medical officer of a given state or the nation, but especially the states, throughout COVID. Literally move like strings moving the hearts of politicians. It was literally, how many times did in our state Berejiklian or Hazard or anyone else, even the blimmin' police minister, basically get asked a question or get asked about some policy decision and then immediately defer to the chief medical officer. Immediately, chief health officer, sorry.
From a Christian...
Immediately defer, no accountability. So making all these decisions, it's not really me making the decision, it's this unelected bureaucrat over here that no one knew 5 minutes ago.
From a Christian point of view and from a point of view of Acts 16, it's the same or very similar spirit.
Yeah, similar. Yeah, sure.
It's spirit of Python.
In many respects, yeah, it's a similar, at least in a similar sense. Yeah, it's a semblance of power that is derived from some other sense that's not the. You can't. Well, that's the problem. Well, that's what happens though. See. You end up circling back. I know I keep doing it. I'm not going to do it today because I've made this point before. But this is my point about the importance of kings. When you remove the highest political authority in the land that is meant to keep in check the political aristocratic class, all that is left is just the political class.
I am flabbergasted. I have heard in the last 12 months the remorse and the backtracking by chief medical officers around the world.
Sure.
Especially around the Western world, who regret locking down populations,
You've heard it particularly in Britain, surprisingly.
who regret putting in authoritarian policies,
Yeah.
and you think you regret it, but what were you thinking at the time?
Exactly.
You see, logic went out the window. You can't explain what happened to the planet Earth rationalistically and logically.
It's on higher power.
You've got
but
to,
exactly,
you've
yeah,
got to
100%.
introduce the spiritual element.
Yeah, correct.
Because how can these intelligent people, they are intelligent,
Smart people, yeah, for sure.
how could they suddenly scratch their heads thinking, we overrode our positions, our powers, we wouldn't do it again. So what explains how your thinking at the 12 months prior? You can't explain it rationalistically.
No, exactly, because that's what I'm about to say. That's what I'm about to say
That's
next.
another matter.
Yeah, ching, 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 ching. Because what I was about to say is this exactly, because
another matter.
you take, no matter what someone thinks about it,
But we're talking lockstep.
exactly, but
Even African countries.
complete lockstep. But that's the without being smart. Well, let's circle back to that word we used earlier, which is the Greek word for sorcery and witchcraft, pharmakia. Right? Pharmaceutical. How much? No offense. Like Pfizer is serious. Like Pfizer is one of the single biggest corporations on the face of the planet. There's not a gigantic list above them.
With an amazing criminal history.
Amazing. The most criminal history. The single most litigated corporation in history.
The history of corporations.
And also has the single biggest fine of, I think, $3.2 billion or something.
I think it was 1.3 billion.
Could have the numbers around, whatever it is. It's something point something billion, right? The single biggest civil liability payment, as well as the most, in terms of like accumulatively, the most
Dozens.
criminal organisation.
And dozens.
Right. And the amount of time. So who's actually the drug cartel? Is it Sinaloa and Juarez, or is it Pfizer and Moderna? Right. But that's a whole different issue. But yeah,
I remember saying this to people, and I'm
the answer is all
sure
of them,
you
just for the record.
made overtures along these very same lines. I said to them in February 2020,
Yeah.
you're willing to take by their own confession, an experimental procedure that has not been tried.
Yes, and that's a matter of fact. That's not an
On
opinion that it
humans.
was. Yes.
You're prepared to do that
The statement of
from a
fact.
company that has a long list of criminal liability,
Correct.
including
Including in clinical trials.
misrepresenting clinical trial data,
Correct. Yep.
in fraudulently
Yep.
misrepresenting in advertising,
All of the above.
and so on and so forth.
Yep.
You're prepared to take something like this into your body? Yes.
Well, that's the difference. Yeah, but see, so the interesting thing is the answer comes with the answer, but see, the average person has because the average person had about as much knowledge of Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca as they did of chief health officers, which was
or
zero.
Ukraine.
Or Ukraine, yeah, which was zero. No one has any popular understanding of what those things are. If you talk to the average person and mention the name BlackRock, they have no concept as to what that is.
That's true.
Which is fascinating because BlackRock is the single largest
Amazing.
funder of everything in the world. They have $10 trillion in portfolio holdings. That the power that wields, if they were a country, they'd be the third largest GDP on earth.
Amazing.
It's astronomical. And yet the average person doesn't understand just the basic ways in which the world works. Like, it's fascinating.
Truly amazing.
But that's why people are so easily manipulated. How many times does God say in the scriptures, in reference to just obviously the context in which it's found, but he says, my people perish for a lack of knowledge. That might be one of the single truest statements in the Bible, and that's really saying something, right? My people perish, because that can be applied no matter how small or large the scale is.
It's being applied spiritually.
Exactly.
Mainly.
Yeah, and that's 100%
Lack
correct.
of knowledge
But
of the one true God.
Exactly, but that's what it always boils down to. And so no matter what level, this tiniest all the way up to the biggest, God himself, at all levels, that statement, that's one of the truest things that's perhaps ever been uttered in the history of humanity.
Lack
Like,
of
people perish
knowledge
for a
of
lack
the
knowledge.
one true God leads to eternal death.
Correct. It leads to facing the penalty and the justice of the things that one has done wrong in life, as opposed to Christ, who is the substitute for us. And so at the grandest levels, literally the cosmic eternal levels, all the way down to the smallest little contextual things, my people perish for a lack of knowledge. Right? People perish, right? Things go wrong, people are harmed, people die through a lack of knowledge. And that can apply at any level. Like I'm saying, it's a universal truth,
It applies
which
to
is why
all
God
of us.
says it. Yeah, yeah, it applies to us. And the exact same thing goes here. It's just the blinding. One of those points you made earlier. I mean, the blinding and circling onto back to the hypocrisy thing, the absolute just bombastic hypocrisy, appealing to the law, and at the exact same time completely violating the law. It's just so the whole, and they're whipping. And by the way, and again, no offense, this is democracy in action. This is whipping up the mob. Right? So all the people, many of whom you would assume at least a portion of them would have been Roman citizens themselves, are now going to beat up a Roman citizen, even though they know that if they got themselves beaten up, hey, you want to talk about the other level of hypocrisy? The Roman citizens here who are beating up Paul and Silas, who are Roman citizens, what would their reaction be if they got beat up? You can't beat me up, I'm a Roman citizen. You see what I'm saying? So every level, so the mob level here, the democratic mob level that's beating up them, hypocrisy. The magistrates, so the actual civil magistrate, the judiciary, the magisterial authority, hypocrisy. The wealthy power brokers that are appealing to them, so that's kind of up at this level as well, but parallel to it, hypocrisy. So literally at all levels, hypocrisy, from literally top to bottom. It's just one giant exercise in hypocrisy. And whipping up the mob, using mass mob tactics, which is what that word democracy comes from. It's a power of the people. You're witnessing the power of the people in action, namely the power of the people, to absolutely and hypocritically violate Roman law while trying to appeal to Roman law.
When you look at the most locked down city on the planet Earth,
Melbourne, yeah.
And you look at what happened during one incident, which is videoed, I've seen it, I'm sure you have, where the police special squads come out in their riot
That's
gear,
the riot squad, and they open fire.
Firing rubber bullets into Melbourne people, Melbourne constituency.
I think it's on Burke Street.
I'm not aware of any civil, what is it, human rights actions that have been brought by the Melbourne citizenry against their police force. Are you aware of something
on that? Well, there have been things like that. So, like the example, there was one incident caught on camera where an individual was surrendering in a train station, and the cop quite literally like suplexes his head into the ground. I think also when there was a protest and people were moving with the police behind them, a police officer rushes an elderly woman, clearly I think she's like
70-something-year-old woman,
and knocks her over unconscious, and then also while she's clearly unconscious, he pepper sprays her in the face.
That's right. Yes, that's
but the incident you're referring to there is that big incident where there were protesters, unarmed, obviously, on the sidewalk, not even in the road, on the sidewalk, on public property. And they deploy the riot squad, as well as I think even elements of the SOG, the SOG, the Special Operations Group, although don't quote me on that, which is their police tactical unit. I don't think they were part of that one, but they may have been. But anyway, they certainly deploy riot squad guys. And they advance from like 100 plus meters up the road, advance on the unarmed crowd on the sidewalk, not even blocking traffic in the road, and open fire on them with less than lethal rounds. And I think if my memory serves me, again, don't quote me, I think if my memory serves me correctly, that in that instance, a man like received permanent damage in one of his eyes from getting shot by a less than lethal round to the face. As if, oh, that won't affect the guy's life. He's now blind in one eye, assuming that's the event I'm thinking of, don't quote me. But I certainly recall that being a headline. But either way, it doesn't matter if no one gets injured. You are opening fire with less than lethal rounds on an unarmed crowd, obstructing nothing.
This is the same government. This is the same government that then legislates that if someone who is gay wants to try to not be gay, that person cannot go to a Christian and be prayed with by a Christian.
And ministered to, yeah, even though that's what they're desiring, and it's like they're being kidnapped. They exactly, like I've talked to people, I've talked to my fair share of people who have been struggling with issues of transgenderism, for example, who have come to me because they are riddled with anxiety, they're riddled with depression, and they want help, they want healing. They want restitution.
Inner peace.
They want peace. Great, right? And then, but if I was to help them like I have in New South Wales, it's still legal at this point, but if I was to do that in Victoria and someone found out, there is every single possibility at this point under Victorian legislation that I'd literally be arrested for that.
You would be.
For helping someone seeking my help. It's
You'd be
incredible.
jailed.
Not going out and, let's go kidnap someone and then force them to... No. Someone voluntarily seeking help, right? And that's a I'm not going to obviously talk names, but there are people who I still, to this day, am ministering to and helping through those very issues that they voluntarily want my help with.
No, that's what the Victorian government specifically aimed at.
That's my... Well, exactly.
Voluntary seeking of help by someone seeking inner peace.
Exactly.
Going to a Christian is now illegal
In Victoria.
in these circumstances.
But now we're back to the point of whole
But you can
legality
go and
doesn't equal
fire
morality.
rubber bullets into crowds, and that's not a breach of humanity by their own. We're signatories to the Human Rights Convention.
Yeah, but no one cares about that in Australia anymore. Yeah, we are, but no one takes that seriously in Australia at all, unfortunately. And so after they've beat them, they arrest them. Verse 23 and 24 just finish off nicely. Yep, when they had inflicted them with many wounds, so assault occasioning actually bodily harm, as you'd say here in New South Wales, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to guard them securely, who, having received such a command, threw them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. So this is essentially basically like what you would refer to as a high security section of the prison itself. Solitary confinement, as we would usually say in many of our prison systems. So they're actually locked, chain and ball, so it were, physically in a pretty small, tight cell. Not even just a general part of the prison, but basically like a solitary confinement. You wouldn't be allowed out in any capacity. You're hopefully fed one meal a day, and very tight space. Dark. It's essentially a dungeon, basically a dungeon within the prison. And so then, so the story that we flow on to, that finishes there, obviously. The story that we then, as we continue through the historical account, we finish off the chapter in the next lesson, which will be verses 25 to the end, with an incredible kind of finish to this whole saga, as it were. And so we look forward to that next week. But yeah, look, to summarise, you've got a very significant, powerful religious figure in the form of the priestess of Apollo, who is being wielded for fraudulent monetary profit, right? A group of powerful men in the city, or powerful people in general in the city who are, we're not told their gender, we're just told that they're masters, so there could be women there as well, who knows? But powerful people in the city who are wielding this powerful religious figure and authority to prey, P-R-E-Y, prey on the downtrodden and the vulnerable, because that's who goes and seeks fortunes from priestesses, from people who are, wanting to have their fortunes told, who are wanting to...
I don't think it's the downtrodden and the vulnerable. I think it's the middle class, the average person in the street.
Hold on, let me finish the point, because that's part of where I'm getting to. But who are most likely preying on the downtrodden and on the vulnerable, those who are seeking in desperation answers, as well as, which is the point I was moving to, as well as those who are also using it for the same kind of power broker principles that the masters are using her for, which is basically you seeking to have fortunes told from the gods so that they can then become successful in business, they can become successful in politics, in law, whatever it happens to be. So there's all manners of levels of people that are utilising this little criminal enterprise that this crew's got going on, this cabal. And then when this cabal has its power snatched from it by God and by the power of Christ through his servants, through Paul and co, it brings just a little bit of a counter reaction, because now the corrupt, money-driven, power-driven criminal enterprise of these people has been snatched right from underneath them by God and by his servants. And so that brings the ire and the wrath of not just the group, but also their lackeys in the state.
Actually, I never thought about this, but the crowd would have been incensed that their conduit to the spirit realm and the oracular
That's what I mentioned earlier. Yeah.
insights was taken away from them.
Exactly, that's
In other words, take away the stargazing, take away the horoscopes, you get people riled up.
Correct.
Very riled up. Isn't that interesting? That this crowd would have been incensed because they would have been going to this girl on a regular basis, paying her money because they wanted to know whom to marry, whom to divorce, whom to do business
with, lawfare, all the kinds of stuff. That's the point I'm making. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's the point I'm making.
So it says a lot for us. So if you take away, access to cheap drugs, alcohol, marijuana, nicotine, I think you'd have rioting.
All kinds of things.
You'd have rioting.
Even things that are seemingly less
marijuana.
nefarious.
Did I mention marijuana?
Yeah. Things that are seemingly less nefarious. And now I'm gonna. Oh, should I say this? Yeah, why not? Let's do it. I'm not trying to open a new can of worms because we're finishing, but I would say it as a simple statement. Okay. So the Christian position on the array of contraceptives, especially chemical ones like Plan B, for example, and other forms of mifepristone and stuff like that, is very, very clear. It's an interruption and a manipulation of the natural human biological process that God has created to bring forth literally the future of mankind. Okay, the Christian position is pretty clear on. I would, if I were a betting man, I would bet considerable sum of money that if you, criminalized or removed, morning after pill as an example, you would literally have riots in the street. And not only would you have riots in the street, I reckon that you'd actually get a surprisingly sizable percentage of people sitting in a pew in a church who would be rather miffed.
Yep. Look what happened when Roe v. Wade was taken away from federal...
Rightfully overturned.
Federal
there were literal rights.
And thrown back to the states. Look what happened on the streets of the USA.
Exactly. So a decision gets...
The green light for abortion in the case of Roe versus Wade...
In the United States. The Constitution of 1973 was the deciding decision. Yeah.
Was essentially overturned recently, in the last 6 months-ish.
Yeah.
In America, what the US Supreme Court did was say, look, this is no longer a federal issue. It's not a federal healthcare issue. We're allowing each state to decide individually what their position on abortion is.
Yeah.
And there were women who gathered together in great numbers, and men.
Irresponsible men who love abortion because it means they can use women however they want and not bear the consequences. Yeah. Yeah,
and there were demonstrations, but in some of the demonstrations got
rioters.
Heated.
Straight up rioters.
Yeah.
Exactly, straight up rioters. Because it was seen as taking away something. Now, in one sense, it kind of was. The problem is it was taking away something that never should have been there. It doesn't take, no matter what your religious beliefs are or even moral convictions are, it really doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that people back in 1789 didn't believe that abortion was something that should be morally acceptable. Like, irrespective of what you think about abortion, it's very clear that 250 years ago, people did not write that into the Constitution. But that's basically what Roe v. Wade was saying. That the whole issue with Roe v. Wade and then another decision that came down the pike nearly 20 years later, Casey versus Planned Parenthood, in 1992, which would kind of affirm the previous Supreme Court decision, was that under the, I think it was the privacy clause? I can't remember. Part of the 14th Amendment, which had to do with freeing slaves and other such issues, nothing to do with abortion, allowed for abortion to be constitutionally legal, which it was one of the most embarrassing acts of complete judicial activism and misreading, probably in the history of America. Is that a fair statement from you, resident jurisprudential? Yeah, obviously, right. And that's then overturned. But you overturn it, and then it doesn't even make abortion illegal in any sense. It just kicks it from the federal level back down to the state level in America. So then if California wants to make abortion legal up to the very point of birth, or if half of their legislature had their way, they'd probably make it legal post-birth, and that's not my opinion. Like, there are politicians in America who seriously think it should be up to a mother to decide whether or not she kills her child in the first 30 days post-birth, because that's where we are. if California wants to decide to do that, then legally they can. I'm not saying they should morally, obviously, but legally they can. And if states like Mississippi want to outlaw abortion and stop babies being killed, then they can do that too. That's what people rioted over. Like, it's hilarious. It's just fascinating. Because no, you will make sure that you do this. It's like, that's where we are.
It's remarkable.
It's remarkable. Yeah. So yeah, look, you've got power, you've got wealth, and you've got this whole corrupt system just in one giant cognitive distance of corruption and hypocrisy. Hypocrisy at every level, like I highlighted earlier. Corruption top to bottom, and when Christians, in this case of this account, when Christians, deal a death blow to it, it brings the wrath and ire of not just the state but of the people. And that's without being smart. That's what Christians have been dealing with for 2,000 years and counting. Because we as Christians, the prevailing concept that we have had for thousands of years since day one is that we obey God above tyrants. Man does not determine what is morally good or ethical. They used to say morally good or right. God determines that. And there is a higher authority and power above all men, including the state, including politicians, and including the king. Even though I mentioned earlier that the political safeguard is a king over the politicians, the thing that Christians have always understood is that God is also over the king. Having a king is not an automatic safeguard. It's a brilliant one, because it keeps the greed and the envy of the political class in check, and you run into problems like we have for the last 250 years when you remove them, either literally like the French did or functionally like we have. But rather, at the same time, there is always a higher authority, and that is God. And when you remove God from being a higher authority above the state, tyranny follows every single time, and every possible instance in human history testifies to that exact example. I could literally be here all day demonstrating to you from verifiable evidenced portions of history that is true in literally every single case. So, yeah, let's end there. As I said, we'll finish the chapter in the next lesson. So,
Thank you.
Too easy. Thanks, guys. Thank you.